Hi all. So today into the which is part 4. This is chapters 10. And what this section does is it elaborates how does the government and the state interact with market economies and what are the concerns to that market operations bring on. So with that, we'll hop right into it. In order to understand this discussion, though, the real key is to understand the concept of externalities. And we'll talk about what externalities are on this next slide. Basically, externalities in economic jargon are the uncompensated impact of one person's actions on the well-being of a bystander. Unintended consequences caused by any action, basically, is a more layman's term of saying this. There's examples of this. We have pollution from industry and cars, which create environmental damage beyond the economic purpose of industry and cars themselves. We have restored buildings. So in downtown Athens, for example, when we restore historic buildings, it makes the downtown area more desirable. People want to go there more often. It raises the value of other buildings. Barking dog. No one gets a dog to bark. And while we love our dogs and they're adorable and great friends, a barking dog creates a negative externality for your neighbor because they don't get the benefits of your dog. They barking. And then new technology. To give you kind of a really impressive example of this, Google Scholar is the origins of Google, and Google Scholar basically is a interface by which you can research academic papers, scholarly articles, scholar publications. That's what Google was originally intended to do, but the algorithm worked well, and so it expanded it into a general search engine. Now, these externalities actually, of course, will create some inefficiencies. Basically, when we discussed marketplaces, we talked about what we would consider the benefits to private cost and private value. In a way, you can say that demand equals private value. While similarly, you can say supply equals private cost. Now, why is this the case? Well, if we think of demand as we've defined it earlier as the willingness to pay for a good, then demand, this willingness to pay, reflects the private value of all consumers that they attribute to a good. Similarly, the supply curve is defined, and we will explain this in greater detail in a later chapter. The supply curve is ultimately influenced by firms' marginal cost. And so firms are able to produce at how high based upon their cost. And so the supply curve overall integrates these concerns cost. And when we have an equilibrium, this is in the market, right, that renders the price where the private cost and the private. So in this example, we're discussing the market for, and so equilibrium for aluminum for the private sector is simply, again, where demand and supply, or where private cost equals private value. Negative externalities exist in the industry of aluminum. And a negative externality is simply put an externality which adds to the public cost beyond the private cost. And so pollution is an example of this. Now, remember how we said that cost reflects the supply curve? If negative externalities exist, it adds to the cost by incorporating public cost into the supply curve, hence a leftward shift in supply. What we see is when we come over here, the supply for the aluminum supply based on its private cost is here. And basically what the supply is telling us is their private cost. See that for aluminum firms, it is in their interest to produce a higher amount of this good. However, when we consider the fact that aluminum as a byproduct has pollution, and pollution is damaging to the environment, what we might find is that while aluminum is used, we would not like as much aluminum produced. This public cost of the damages brought on by the consequences of pollution leads to a leftward shift or an increase in the total cost. And the reason why is the social cost is the private cost and the external cost. In this case, the external cost is our negative externality, which our negative externality is pollution. This says that when decreases and corresponding with this increased social cost, we have a new social optimum, and that new social optimum has a lower quantity than otherwise would occur in the market. Again, since there's bad consequences, negative consequences of the full production of this good, you would prefer a reduced quantity from where it exists in the open market, because that will actually increase the overall social good. So there's ways to get around this. There's ways that we can cause the supply to decrease. One way is that we can internalize the externality, i.e. alter incentives, those creating the externality. One example of this, a clear negative externality of smoking, is secondhand. So insurance, accordingly, accounts for smokers' risky behavior and the negative externalities of smoking and incorporate into higher interest rates and higher insurance rates. And what that means is that we are internalizing to those creating the cost and the externality, the cost of that externality itself. However, we also have goods which have positive externalities, and positive externalities shift the demand curve rightward. This demonstrates the public value. A perfect one case here is education. Education has several external benefits. For many people, this is where they socialize and they meet their friends. For many people, this is where they meet their spouses and start families. These are considered socially good things. For many other people, this is where they make network connections for future jobs. Ultimately, there's several benefits education offers. For that reason, it has a social value that is greater than the private value. And so the social value is, again, the private value, the demand curve, plus the external benefit. So if we look here, we see the demand curve should rightward to account for it is better in society for more people than would initially to go do the perform the act. Now, notice too that in this example, we now want an increase in the optimum quantity. So society finds that what the market would decide is not as much as we're like, and so it decides to incent a higher quantity of demand. However, in doing so, notice what else happens. We get the same consequence we would get if we increase demand and energy. We now also have a higher equilibrium price. So our equilibrium price is now higher than it would be without this additional benefit. The quantity optimum is also greater. This is an interesting point because it helps us consider and explain why is college education so expensive. There's several benefits to college. It develops human capital. It socializes, allows people to travel, and provides opportunities they would otherwise not have. However, the United States, in order to alter incentives to encourage those positive externalities, have increased student loans and provided they've afforded affordable scholarships and more and more people to go to school. It has also led to the consequence that schools are much more expensive than they ever have been before. Now, how can the government affect externalities and how can the public respond to externalities? Well, there's a few. The most common is command and command and control is a form of regulation which legislates rules and constraints on market operation. There's a balancing act here between encouraging benefits without it creating costs. So, for example, so basically putting a cap on how much pollution firms can create, that is an example of a command. In contrast, there are also market-based policies, and market-based policies include corrective taxes and now, a corrective tax is a tax designed to induce private decision makers to take account of the social costs that arise from a negative externality. So, pollution taxes basically would be a tax put on the quantity that you produce of pollution. And so, the more and more a firm produces, the more and more they have to pay in taxes. However, their subsidy is a kind of reverse tax, and this is an example of where we would like to encourage people to produce something they otherwise might not. So corn subsidies are a tax relief and tax reimbursement to corn farmers in the Midwest that is meant to induce people to continue producing high levels of corn. Now, there can be a combination of these, and a combination is a market-based policy called the tradable pollution. This is a very clever policy in the sense that it regulates the market by putting a cap on how much pollution may be produced. And the way it puts that cap is by creating and setting a certain amount of pollution, i.e., the permit to pollute, and it puts a cap on the value of those permits. So basically, a permit may say you can produce 500 pounds of carbon, and then it releases a set amount of carbon. So basically, and it sets a set amount of carbon per permit. So basically, you have this is the total amount of pollution that can occur based upon the value of pollution per permit times the permits available. However, where this functions as almost a pollution tax as well is that these permits, so if your company is very healthy and if your company is very environmentally, and sell these permits to other firms. To give you a classic example, Tesla makes a whole lot of money permits to firms like Ford and Dodge who make trucks that are not as environmentally friendly. And so this allows it provides a very firm a certain amount of permits to pollute. Healthy firms sell their permits to inefficient. Now, what's the contrast between the effects of these taxes versus permits? Well, if we look at a corrective tax for pollution, what the corrective tax does is it sets a price. And basically, the demand for pollution rights then determines how much is produced. And what we find is that you have to lead to a higher of pollution overall. So, because basically firms that have a demand that are willing to pay for this pollution, they will pay up to the tax of the corrective tax's price. However, in contrast, what the pollution permit does is it sets the supply. And so with the quantity of supply, now the price of this pollution is determined by where the demand for pollution rights intersects with the supply of pollution set by the government. So it's a modest difference. One puts a price which ultimately affects demand by the fact that it is now more expensive to consume. The other one is it sets the supply, and the price is then an outcome of the supply curve. Now, there are objections to economic analysis of pollution. One such objection is pollution is a moral issue. Economists honestly largely ignore because denying trade-offs doesn't change their existence and can lead to even more disastrous outcomes. Not that it's always used correctly, but economists are very much in the solution to not be worse than the problem itself. We could pollution overnight by banning the use of all fossil fuels. But the damage that would do to the economy would be so significant. Private solutions to externalities do. Some of those private solutions we've talked about already. We internalize externalities through taxes, subsidies, and then insurance penalties. Other examples include charities, which the caveat here is that charities are often limited, but there's a host of groups which offer scholarships, for example, to encourage people to go to school. Similarly, we can achieve agreement between relevant parties if they negotiate about the acceptable level of extra. What we can find is that we can probably we can probably achieve the most efficient outcome. Additionally, though, contracts allow a binding agreement between two groups that, as part of agreement between relevant parties, defines the externalities and both parties' liabilities to the externality. It's an interesting proposition that if private parties can bargain without cost over the allocation of resources, they can solve the problem of externalities on their own. So Coase theorem, there's this link to Wiki. It's a fascinating thought. Basically, as long as people can negotiate for free, they can eventually solve the problem of externalities, is the argument Coase arrived. Now, why do private solutions not always work? Simply put, transaction costs are one. The cost that parties incur in the process of agreeing to and following through on a bargain. Every transaction incurs a spent time, right? And so you might realize that a certain negotiation is taking way too much of your time. So if the time required to reach an agreement is too high, that can mean the private solution is free. Haggling and holding out can prolong the problem further. If both sides believes that by being reluctant and not help, they can force their way and get leverage, that can hold back negotiation. We see this a lot in Congress. So Congress right now is arguing over a stimulus bill, and both are trying to hassle to get the edge on the stimulus. And ultimately, this is an idea that holding out to get more leverage is better, even though the problem of the COVID economic crisis is exacerbating. One more thing, though, is additionally groups may ultimately try to achieve through force what they can't achieve through negotiation. Basically, yes, we could negotiate and try to publicly solve this. Why do that when I can just take what force? So this is another concern. This is particularly an institutional question. And again, we can see things like this in DC, but we can see more extreme versions of this throughout the world in coups. This is what we have. Going to wrap up, but just a preview of our next chapter, we'll be getting into public goods and resources. All right. If you have any questions, as always, just shoot me an email or let me know in the comments.